evening, folks.
We have a wonderful evening's entertainment lined up for you, one that will provide several hours of pleasurable relaxation and diversion for you and your family. We hope you'll make this a weekly visit. Bring the family. Bring your friends. We hope you have a wonderful time. Come back soon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Knights of the Pageless Library. This is an audiobook discussion podcast. I am Ryan Knight, and I will be your host for this episode. And on today's episode, I'm going to be discussing Fevre Dream, written by George R.R. Martin and narrated by Ron Donachie. Before I get started with my review of this book, if you would like to join the conversation, please feel free to reach out to us. kotpl.pod@gmail.com is currently the easiest way to get a hold of us. You can find us on YouTube, which might be where you're listening to this at, Facebook, Twitter, all that stuff. Email is by far the easiest way, though, so look forward to hearing from you. And with that, let's get on with the review. Fevre Dream was written by George R.R. Martin in 1982, which was a shock to me when I found out when I listened to this one. The audiobook recording that I will be reviewing was written, I believe, was recorded in 2012 by Random House Audio. And I listened to this one through Audible. Again, I'll just say if you have anywhere else you like to listen to your audiobooks, please feel free to share those with me. I would like to check out some other platforms just so I can spread information about that should other people be interested as well. The title that I listened to through Audible, though, however, just to make everybody aware, there are two separate titles, it looks like. Same name, same runtime and everything, other than the one has like a red background on the cover and one has like a dude standing in front of the river with a gold kind of background. I don't really know how else to describe it. I will be doing the one with the golden background. And just quickly listening to the samples of the two, it seems like the one with the golden background has a slightly higher audio quality to it. So take that for what you will. If you were to purchase this one outright, though, the one with the red background is cheaper. So not sure why. The one with the red background is $14.52. The one I listened to is $16.95 for some very strange reason. So Fevre Dream for me was a very interesting title. Kind of came out of nowhere. My brother recommended it to me, asked me if I had listened to it, and I kind of picked it up on a whim. Just looking at the cover of the book. You know, we shouldn't really judge a book by its cover, but just looking at the cover of the book, you would never guess what this book is about. It combines two very, very interesting concepts, in my opinion. I'm going to go ahead and spoil a little bit here very early on. So it combines steamboats and vampires, which is an amazing mashup, if you will. It's almost like if you just had a dartboard full of subjects and you threw a couple darts at it, and then George R.R. Martin was like, well, I guess those are the two things I'm doing. Some of this is kind of based in reality. The kind of time frame it's set in, some of the steamboats mentioned, I guess, are real. And then obviously a lot of the other vampire stuff is fictional, as far as I know. I'm not really going to get into what George R.R. Martin is known for. I think most people have probably heard the man's name a time or two, which it was kind of nice, though, to find a title not related to Game of Thrones, if I'm honest, because obviously that's what he's most known for. But it was very cool to listen to a different title from the man who kind of, blew up HBO over the last 10 years. Not that HBO needed blowing up, but you know what I mean. So real quick, what do I think of Ron Donachie as the narrator? Fantastic job. Hands down, one of the better performances I've listened to in quite a while. And I know we say that a lot on this show. I think we tend to have very good luck with some of the narrators that we listen to. I haven't really had a solid complaint, I don't think, about a narrator in a while. But I would put Ron Donachie up there for sure. Might have to do a top 10 narrators or something here soon, because he would go firmly on that list. His portrayal of some of these characters, especially in this book, pretty powerful, if I'm being honest. If you don't believe me, I guess head on over to Audible and just listen to the sample real quick. That's free for you to do. Just listen to the 5 minutes of it, and I think you'll know what I'm talking about. Very, very good performance. Unfortunately, as far as Audible goes, Ron Donachie only has a few titles under his belt. About 6 to be precise, and 2 of those are Fevre Dream, listed multiple times. So I don't really know why he doesn't have more titles, because this might be a man I could listen to read a phone book. He does such good voices, such good range of his characters, to where it's very, very easy to tell who is speaking and, you know, when we're going back and forth in conversations. There's also a character in this book that may be my most hated character in a book, which is saying a lot coming from me. Not that I like hate characters a lot, but the way this character is written and voiced just makes me despise this person. And I think Ron Donachie really is who brought that to the next level. This book comes in right at 13 hours and 32 minutes, which is a good length for an audiobook. I feel weird saying that sometimes, but I did notice that on a Facebook discussion that I creep in, somebody asked what you think a good length for an audiobook is. And I've said it before that I think right around 10 hours is a very, very solid point for an audiobook. This one I don't feel like overstays its welcome at 13 hours by any means. When it was over, I'll discuss it here in a little bit after I get over the spoiler wall. This could have gone either way for me. It's a good length, but it could have been shorter or longer. It just kind of depends. And again, I'll try to remember to explain that here in a minute. Okay, is this one easy to follow? I would say so, actually. The way it's written, the way it's told, we bounce back and forth a couple times between a couple different main characters here. Mostly we're following Abner Marsh, the captain, if you will, of our main steamboat that we're talking about, the Fevre Dream. Him and Joshua York. And then we do a little bit bouncing back and forth with our main antagonist. And then their 2 stories kind of clash towards the end. It does a good job. It's pretty straightforward. Not a whole lot of confusing jumps back and forth. So I would say this one's actually pretty easy listening, and it's pretty easy to follow. Easy listening, like I was just kind of alluding to, made very easy by Ron Donachie. His performance kind of elevates this one for sure. I would say there are parts that if you miss, maybe you're gonna be left confused a little bit later on. This isn't really one of those kind of books. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy, I think, for anybody to pick up and listen to. I don't think you're going to be very confused. I think it is pretty well written in that regard. And with that, I would say my overall recommendation of this one is I would highly recommend this one. Maybe not to everyone. If you're looking for maybe kind of a not normal, I can't even really say not normal science fiction type of fantasy novel, this one definitely is in its own kind of niche, which I appreciated about it. The story is pretty unique. The fact that it is kind of based in reality is very cool to me. It's sort of a, how do I say this? Like an alternate reality is how I'm going to say it. Vampires. I don't want to get too spoilery here for anybody who does want to listen to it. If you do want to listen to it, or if you found yourself kind of on the fence about it, I would say this one is worth your time. It's worth your Audible token. It's definitely worth your time for sure. So I will leave it at that before I pass the spoiler wall. I'm not going to try to go too into detail on this one. I think I've said in the past, I'm going to try to keep these a little more simple, unless somebody specifically would like me to go into, a lot of detail, almost like a Spark Notes type thing. I am very willing to do that, but lately I've been kind of finding myself short on time, changed jobs. So I'm just going to kind of try to keep these a little more minimal after took me over a couple minutes to just say all that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. You got my recommendation. Definitely a thumbs up on this one from me. And I can guarantee you my brother would say the same thing. Wish he was here to talk about this one with me, because I know it would be a good conversation. But with that, going to pass the spoiler wall. So if you don't want the book spoiled for you, please pause the podcast here. Go listen to it, and then come back here and listen to what I have to say about it. This is a timepiece. This is a kind of period piece. So remember, we're dealing in 1860s South, in the southern part of the United States. I believe earlier I said South America. What an idiot. So we're talking like hardcore slavery times, things like that. And remember, this book was written in the 80s. So I just want to make everyone abundantly clear. If you get offended by words, by the treatment of people in this fiction novel, and by the treatment of people that obviously this was real things, this really did happen. I'm not trying to downplay that. This is a fiction novel, though. If you kind of get queasy over things like that, or just are uncomfortable about, very, very, very harsh language, language that would make a lot of people very uncomfortable for good reason, be aware that it's prevalent in this book, okay? Again, it's an older book written in the 80s about a time period when none of that stuff was frowned upon. So, again, let's just be abundantly clear of that before you get into this, if that's something that bothers you, you might want to steer clear of this one. So this story is told in third person. It is set in the year 1957. And we're talking about the southern United States. So, Louisiana, Mississippi, in those areas. And we're talking about steamboats. This one opens up very interestingly. So we have our main character, Abner Marsh, who is described as kind of a pretty ugly, big, burly dude. And he sits down to talk with this gentleman named Joshua York. And right away we get this kind of very interesting description kind of from Abner's point of view of Joshua York. He's kind of tall. This is how I get it. He's kind of like a tall, maybe more like gaunt looking, very pale man, blonde hair, but it's something about his eyes. Abner Marsh would probably be considered a intimidating man. And even he is kind of a little off-put by Joshua York when he first meets him. They sit down to have dinner, which I believe it's really late at night too. These are kind of your first little hints, especially on a second listen. It's interesting to go back and hear the little hints of all of this stuff. In this first meeting though, Joshua York basically is offering Abner Marsh. Abner is not necessarily a disgraced riverman, steamboat riverman, but he owns they call them packet companies, and it was the Fevre River Packet Company. And he was doing very well for himself, but I believe it was like an ice storm type thing, ended up destroying a bunch of his boats, and I believe one of them blew its boiler and stuff like that. So he's only got one boat left, the Eli Reynolds, which will come back up later in the story. He's down on his luck right now. And Joshua York is offering to buy him a new steamboat and be a partner in the Fevre River Packet Company. So they will kind of run this new steamer 50-50. There's just a couple weird stipulations that Joshua York has, and that is that Abner Marsh basically will do whatever Joshua needs him to do and ask very little questions about it. That's obviously, we know why, but at the time, Abner has no idea. All Abner knows is he throws out some ideas, and at the time, the steamboat that was named the Eclipse was considered the best of the best on the river for where they were at. And Abner basically throws it out there and says, if you can build me a steamboat like that could race and beat the Eclipse in every way, right? It's faster, it's just as big, it's beautiful, it hauls people, it hauls freight, it's going to be the talk of the river. If you can do that, I will agree to this. Joshua says, let's do it. Let's make this boat. So the boat gets completed, and it's named the Fevre Dream, which in the beginning is actually said to be kind of an ill omen. I mean, the word fever could be used for any number of bad things, but because it's Fevre River Packets and because it's Abner Marsh's dream, it's kind of their dream together, right? Him and Joshua York. That's how Abner came up with the name. They discuss a lot of details about the ship while it's being built in the shipyard, and then we kind of skip forward to the ship finally being completed, right? Put into the water, put through its paces. Abner Marsh fills it with a crew basically of his own picking. I believe it's a bunch of guys who have worked with him before in the past on his previous ships and stuff like that. A couple notable names is Jonathan Jeffers, Harry Mike Dunn, and Whitey Blake, I believe, is the lead engineer. These will come up a little bit later. Now, shortly after we get the information about the Fevre Dream, we also jump to another area, and we jump in on this gentleman called Sour Billy Tipton, who is at an auction. And the auction is pretty jacked up because they're selling people. I'm going to refer back to my previous kind of warning that, again, if you're uncomfortable with this kind of stuff, it's going to be pretty prevalent throughout this title, unfortunately. So we have Sour Billy Tipton, who ends up outbidding a gentleman for this young, very attractive lady. And then we find out that he is buying people because then he takes them back to this kind of isolated plantation manor that they have. And he takes this gal back to a man named Damon Julian. Or at least Damon Julian is kind of who's in charge of this group of what we first are kind of told are people. But they're not people. This is kind of a nest of vampires. Sour Billy being the only human among them. And basically it's explained later that, vampires will do this. They will promise that they could turn the human into a vampire so that the human is then given, eternal life and the ability to regenerate, things like that. This comes to a head at the end of the book. So Sour Billy delivers this young girl and the vampires feed on her. This is kind of the deal that they have. It is discussed during this time, though, that there may be some kind of, vampires are getting a little uncomfortable with their whereabouts for multiple reasons, that they kind of are overstaying their welcome. They're kind of, it's one thing if they take and kill slaves, but Damon I believe he made the mistake of killing like the plantation owner and basically being kind of stupid. But we're going to find out later on that Damon Julian is like potentially 1,000 years old. I don't even know if they actually ever say how old he is, but he's a very old vampire. And we're going to find out he's essentially just a psychopath. So everything we got about Joshua York in the beginning, it kind of tips you off a little bit here that there's something different going on with Joshua, but it doesn't show its hand yet about Joshua. We jump back over to the Fevre Dream as they kind of are getting the Fevre Dream, getting its feet wet, if you will. Getting her steam up, putting her through her paces. They're getting it loaded down with cargo, and it's a massive ship. It's like 350 feet long or something like that, which is very large. It kind of shocked me. I guess I didn't realize how big the rivers in the south part of the United States are to be able to support a ship that was that big. So one of the first kind of things that tips Abner Marsh off to there's something weird going on is the Damon Julian I'm going to do that multiple times, I'm sure. Joshua York kind of stays to his cabin during the day, and then he only kind of wants to hang out at night or after the sun goes down. And one of the first things that happens is once they're kind of loaded down with cargo, they want to kind of see what the ship can do. They see another steamer on the water, so they get it up and going. They get the Fevre Dream going, and they're going to try to pass the steamer, right? They're going to overtake it because that's a big deal on the river. If your ship is faster and it can pass up other ships, that means it can do the job faster and better and so on. Abner goes to try to wake Joshua up to show him this kind of, big moment that their ship is about to do, passing this first little steamer that is going to maybe start building them a reputation. And it's during the middle of the day, and Joshua's like irate and so pissed off that Abner woke him up. No matter what the circumstances was, he tells him you cannot wake him up. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier that I don't know if they shared it yet or not. Joshua has this very specific like liquor that he drinks, and he shares it with Abner at one point. And Abner says it's absolutely disgusting, but Joshua is always drinking it. And we're going to find out a little bit later as to what that is. So it's at this point that Abner's getting a little bit suspicious about kind of what's going on with Joshua. And later on, they end up kind of picking up some more passengers at Joshua's behest that are kind of the same way, right? They only are out at night, a lot of weird stuff going on. Joshua also starts making some very weird requests to stop at some kind of weird places, usually like out of the way wood yards, which would be fine, but he wants to stop and hold the ship up for like multiple days at a time, which in Abner's opinion is an absolute no-no, right? You're trying to make a business. You're trying to be the best, the fastest, the most reliable. And these little kind of detours Joshua wants to take are really screwing that up. Well, we come to find out a little bit later that basically what Joshua is doing is he's stopping at these specific places where there's kind of hints about murders taking place, but murders that seem a little out of place. So one of the ones that they stop at, a man was killed and they believe he was eaten by a wolf. But Joshua is like snipping these things out of newspapers, and then they're stopping to investigate that. Well, they're stopping at the same places where these clippings came from. We don't necessarily know very early on that he's investigating these things. And basically what we come to find out is that Joshua is obviously a vampire. We come to find out that he wanted to get on the steamboat, and then he basically filled the steamboat with things that humans assumed about vampires, right? So it's filled with silver, it's filled with mirrors, because, you know, the rumor was that vampires would show no reflection. It's rumored that vampires can't enter water. It's rumored that they can't enter a home without being invited. The vampires have kind of leaned into these things, right? Because then it just makes them blend in that much more with humans when they can say, see, I'm not a vampire. I can, you know, hold silver, or I can drink holy water, or what have you. It gets revealed to Abner, who is sworn to secrecy. He can't reveal it to anybody else, but he says, I got to reveal it to a couple people because obviously you guys could just kill me and I have no leg to stand on. And what it ends up boiling down to is that Joshua, this liquor that he drinks, is basically his own synthetic blood concoction that satiates his red thirst, is what they call it, when he feels the need to drink human blood. They discuss how animal blood can kind of satiate the feeling, but it's usually human blood that really will only satisfy the feeling. We learn that vampires and humans are actually two separate races in this story. So yes, while we look very similar, vampires are their own distinct race. They cannot breed with each other. You know, they couldn't breed with humans. They can barely breed with each other, which is actually why Joshua is worried, because he thinks their race is going to die out. So his goal in this story is to have Abner Marsh kind of take him up and down the river so that he can find more of his people, and he can give them this synthetic blood, or his concoction, to help satiate their red thirst in a way that's not harming humans, so they can learn to even better live alongside humans. Obviously, one of the things standing in his way is Damon Julian, because Damon believes humans are cattle and should be fed upon. They are no better than when humans eat, cows. Interestingly enough, we have a couple times where there are confrontations between Joshua and Damon, and they're both vying for what they call Bloodmaster. And it's a very kind of animalistic thing where, almost like dogs, when they get in a big group, one of them will probably be pack leader and the others will kind of follow. The vampires have a very kind of similar thing. The rest of them can kind of sense who is the leader. When they compete for this leader position, this Bloodmaster, they don't like classically attack each other, right? They don't like grow giant fangs and their nails come out and they fight each other, and then whoever loses is not pack leader. They actually just kind of circle each other and stare into each other's eyes, and it's more of actually like a mental fight that they have to have. And one of the problems is once they finally confront Damon Julian, Joshua loses to him. Joshua loses the Bloodmaster rights against Damon Julian. So what ends up kind of happening is Damon ends up kind of taking over the Fevre Dream, and he wants to run the show now, him and Sour Billy. And like I mentioned earlier, Sour Billy is that character who may or may not be my most hated character ever written in any book that I've listened to up to this point. He is a ridiculously vile human being. The only reason he serves Damon is obviously because Damon has promised him he'll turn him into a vampire at some point, which we find out by the end is impossible. It's not like the stories where if a vampire bites you and you imbibe of their blood that you will turn into a vampire. It's physically impossible. Sour Billy will never become a vampire. basically what this kind of all ends up boiling down to is that Abner Marsh has to kind of help Joshua succeed against Damon. Because, man, this is kind of where I said the book could go either way on length. Not actually a lot happens in this book, if I'm honest. There are a couple very high points, a couple very dramatic points, but in reality, not a ton happens. And there's a couple parts that probably could have been shaved down to make them a little bit shorter and shave some runtime off, but I'm not complaining. I like every bit of this book. But there are a lot of kind of times where they literally are just kind of going and they stop and Joshua gets off and they complain about it and he gets back on and they leave and not really a ton happens. During a lot of this, when the Fevre Dream is kind of taken over, Jonathan Jeffers and Harry Mike, who is in charge of like all the deckhands and the roustabouts and things like that, Jonathan Jeffers ends up dying trying to fight Damon Julian in a very brutal way. And unfortunately, Harry Mike, whom I like during a lot of the story, ends up dying to Sour Billy Tipton in a very just scummy way. It just adds to my hatred of Sour Billy, but he gets his in the end. What ends up kind of happening is Abner ends up being forced off of the Fevre Dream. He has to leave because Damon kind of wins. He wins over Joshua, and Joshua can't help Abner Marsh, and he doesn't want him to get killed. So he basically makes Abner leave, and he tells the crew that they bought Abner out, and they're leaving without him. And Abner ends up going and getting his other steamer, the Eli Reynolds, and he ends up chasing down the boat with his other crew off the Eli Reynolds because he wants to take the Fevre Dream back, right? That's his dream. They lose again. He brings a gun. He thinks he's going to win them over and everything, and they lose. They cannot beat Damon Julian. To the point where Abner basically goes into retirement. He kind of hangs up his hat. He's no longer going to be a steamboat riverman. And 13 years pass. 13 years of him just kind of hanging out, getting older. There's a lot of stories about stuff going on the river, right? And the story goes that the Eli Reynolds blew its boilers, and he helps Joshua escape the Fevre Dream. Joshua and this other female vampire, who I can't think of her name right now, she escapes as well. But they have to basically go into hiding because Damon will just end up killing them. And what we find out ends up happening is they run the Fevre Dream aground like way back in at that old plantation they had, and they basically just kind of live on it. Damon ended up doing this thing where he had promised Abner that the Fevre Dream would never be forgotten. And the story they tell of why the Fevre Dream disappears, I believe, was the yellow fever. That's kind of the spiel they give everybody before they change the name of it. He invites all these people on, not like a full complement of people, but they invite a bunch of people on board. And then basically him, Damon, and all the other vampires, there's like 20 of them, they just slaughter all of these people. It's like 300 people. And they kill all of them. And they, like, in a very, very gory way, right? It's just this massive slaughter. So Joshua basically says he can't live with this. So he contacts Abner again, pulls him out of retirement, and basically says, we have to go find Damon and we have to get rid of him. Because otherwise he's going to do something similar, because there's a race between two of the newest ships on the river. And basically Damon wants to put the Fevre Dream kind of in the race as well and do the same thing again on another ship. Abner agrees to go help him. They find their way to the Fevre Dream, which at this point they realize there's no way it's actually going to go through with what they wanted it to go through with. It's basically run down. It's dilapidated. They're not taking care of it. And Sour Billy is there still 13 years later. And he's basically at this point described as a skeleton with skin draped over it. He's so gaunt. He's so pale. He's disgusting because all he's been doing is being a cannibal off of other human beings, because this is what Damon has told him will turn him into a vampire, is drinking human blood and eating human flesh.
And the best part at this point is that Sour Billy's kind of opening line every time he sees someone is, well, well. And he says, well, and it literally, Abner shoots him in the chest with a shotgun because he doesn't want to hear the second, well. Sour Billy's extremely deadly with his knife. So Abner remembers that and doesn't want to let him do anything with his little knife because he is, even though he's a hated character, he's a very capable and able character through most of the book. He ends up blasting Sour Billy. They have a confrontation again between Damon and Joshua because Joshua had explained to Abner that at one point he beat Damon. The thirst was on him strong, and he confronted Damon again, and they locked eyes, and Damon backed down. But it only happened one time in all the amount of times that Damon basically was their kind of bloodmaster. And Abner realizes that if he can flare up Joshua again strong enough, Joshua could beat Damon in a confrontation. The initial confrontation they have doesn't go very well. They confront Damon. Damon ends up beating Joshua to the point where what he does is he knocks out the skylight in the thing and he forces Joshua to sit in the sunlight. Now in this story, sunlight doesn't immediately kill a vampire. Joshua actually uses this to his advantage multiple times to try to prove that he's human by going out in the daylight for several hours at a time. But it has like a third-degree burn type of effect on them later on in the day. At the time, it almost looks maybe like a first-degree burn, right? Very red skin. Maybe it starts to get dry and peeling in some parts. But later that day, they might look like a full-fledged burn victim because their skin it reacts so harshly to the sunlight. So Damon is essentially going to sit Joshua in the seat and make him cook in the freaking sunlight. That's his punishment. Abner wasn't fast enough to beat Damon. He ends up like breaking his arm and losing his shotgun. But at one point, he realizes that Joshua has to be getting thirsty, right? The thirst has to be kind of on him. And if he can get Joshua out of the sunlight, he could probably beat Damon because he's so upset. They end up fighting with Damon to the point where Joshua like fights him in their vampire way, and Abner shoots him in the chest with the shotgun. But that doesn't kill him because they do have like super regenerative abilities. Sour Billy ends up surviving his shotgun blast and his fall. He falls like 20 feet and he survives all of it just to crawl in and try to confront Damon. And Damon basically just saying, yeah, you're not going to ever be a vampire. Like, you're just going to die like this because I lied to you all this time because I needed you to help me obviously do things in the daylight, and you're a piece of shit. So Sour Billy ends up basically with his final breath throwing his little knife and sticking Julian in the eye, which is kind of what gives Joshua and Abner the couple of seconds they need to attack him. Joshua mercifully snaps Sour Billy's neck, so he kind of gets his in the end. You know, he suffers for a long time, which is probably good for him because he's just a horrible person. Oh my gosh, how do they end up killing Damon? I think he ends up shooting him like in the head, basically blowing his head off with his shotgun. It ends up being kind of a very satisfying end to this tyrant monster. It's crazy though how Julian is seen as like this scary, evil tyrant. But in reality, like, it's not like he takes over like a city or a country or a state. He literally just kind of hides in the shadows and kills people for fun. They literally explain that there's a good chance that Julian is so old, he no longer is affected by the red thirst, that he literally just kills for fun at this point. That's kind of his thing because he's bored with life because he essentially can't die by natural causes. Or at least as far as they know, they kind of don't really discuss how long vampires can live, but they think that there's a good chance they're almost immortal. But basically what kind of transpires is that Abner and Joshua kind of decide to go their separate ways. the kind of closing of the book is with Joshua he visits, I believe, a grave that every so often, or it kind of is told in third person that if you were to visit this grave, essentially, and it talks about Abner Marsh's grave once he finally dies. Joshua's kind of continued spreading of his elixir, you know, to the other vampires to try to basically put a stop to vampires feeding on humans. And it kind of talks about how Abner was essentially pivotal in all of this, right? Like his efforts put down this extremist vampire who was very against not feeding on humans. And Abner kind of helped get Joshua the foothold he needed to potentially not overthrow, but spread his word to the rest of the vampires, looking towards a much different future than if Julian were still alive. So that's kind of it. As I kind of said, not a ton happens in this book, and I skipped over a lot of very good details, mostly because I would rather you just go listen to it yourself and decide for yourself. But I think this is an excellent story. It's a very unique story. It's a very, how do I say this? It's a very grounded story, weirdly enough. There's a lot of, it's not so fantastical that you couldn't kind of relate to some of these people or some of these events maybe in your own life, which I think is very interesting and kind of a breath of fresh air when it comes to like a fantasy novel. Because there's usually in a fantasy novel, they're fun to listen to, a lot of fun stuff happens, but nothing that you could see yourself being a part of, right? It's usually that fantastical. So this book's kind of cool. This could be a real story, right? I mean, that's how I'll say it. This could be something that happens in the shadows. And I think that's pretty cool and pretty unique. Very cool to see from obviously the guy who's known for Game of Thrones. So take that for what you will. Again, if you want to discuss this with me, please feel free to reach out, kotpl.pod@gmail.com, or leave a comment, like, share, whatever. All that bullshit that everybody says. I'm going to try to stop saying it because I think it's annoying when I hear it, and I'm not going to try to be annoying to you. So if you're still listening, and I said I was going to keep this one short, I'm looking at my timer, and right now I'm about 43 minutes. Hopefully I can shave a lot of that off in editing. But if you're still with me, I deeply appreciate your attention for as long as you gave it to me, because I know your time is valuable and I don't want to waste it. So thank you for listening. I really appreciate it, and I really hope to catch you in the next one.